so I'm interrupting the normal flow of the video to interject here because the last clip you saw was me pouring resin into the portal here, or the window, and that ended up not turning out quite how I was hoping it would. If I turn on the light, it looks okay with the light off, but if I turn the LED that's embedded in there on, let me adjust the exposure down. Hopefully it comes across, but you can see there's 2 points of light in there, and then there's this dark half moon shape. I don't really know what happened in there. I don't know what that dark part is. Maybe it's just some darker resin. Maybe the pigment's all settled down there. I don't know. But it kind of looks terrible to me. I don't like it. I think the only way to fix it is to mix up some more resin with and make it much darker than what this currently is, and pour. I've got just the tiniest little lip around this metal thing, and just pour a layer of dark pigment on there to hopefully hide it, maybe diffuse the light a little bit more, and we'll see from there. I'm not sure. I don't really know what happened, and there's really no way of knowing without destroying the whole thing. I'd have to completely pop yeah, there's no way of knowing what exactly happened. I don't know if the pigment settled and that created that dark half moon shape, or if the piece of plexiglass or whatever in there maybe moved or shifted, or something else shifted. I don't know. But I'm going to try doing that. Just pour the thinnest, make a very dark batch of resin, and just pour the thinnest little bit in there. So I'm going to go get that set up, and we'll see what happens. Yep. Alright, so here's the finished, I guess you could call it a model or a carving I'm not sure, but here it is. It's finished, and I've been working on this since June of last year, off and on. Most of that was just time based delays, and then there were a couple things that I was legitimately terrified to do, and so I just put them off as much as possible. But it's finished. It's not perfect, but I've accepted that there are just some things that I had to do in order to finish it, and it is just what it is. And I'm actually happy with the way it turned out. Some things, like with the resin, were sort of a happy accident with the way that turned out. As I interrupted the video earlier to explain, the resin sort of caused an issue when I poured it. And I think what ended up happening was, when resin cures, it puts off heat. It's an exothermic reaction. And I think maybe the plexiglass or the Lexan that I had in there to cover the LEDs to sort of create a division between the LED area in the hole and the resin actually either warped or moved or whatever, and caused the LEDs to actually come off, the adhesive to fail. And I think that's that half moon sort of shape that I was describing before. I'll put an insert in here so you can see it again. And that's why you see the 2 points of light, because those are actually the little LED cobs. And you shouldn't see those because those should be on the outer wall, and you shouldn't see 2 distinct points of light like that. So I think that actually the LED strip actually came off, and that's what you're seeing. But it was a happy accident because I wasn't completely happy with the color and with the pattern that the pigments left in that pour. So actually having to go back and pour some more resin that was darker and was also shallower, so the pigments had less time to sort of settle to the bottom, actually turned out to be a happy accident, because I really like the way that this turned out. And regardless of how long the LEDs last embedded in there, because if they go bad and stop working, then there's no fixing it. It still looks really neat and nice, even without the LEDs on. LEDs add a little bit of a whiz-bang factor, but they're actually not necessary. But I would like to put LEDs in as many things as I can, so there they are. So yeah, that was the first sort of hurdle. The other thing was when attaching the rocket with the tube. This is just an aluminum tube, ordered it from McMaster-Carr, and then bent it with a little tube bender and sanded it. So the secret to sanding like aluminum like this, to sort of get that brushed look, is just to sand in one direction. So sand, and then lift up, and then sand. And do that progressively with finer and finer grits. Anyway, when I first glued this in, or epoxied it in, it was working and everything. Everything was copacetic, but even after 12 hours, the epoxy was not cured, and it was all mushy. And the hole, the tolerance on the hole, between the hole and the aluminum tubing is enough that I needed that epoxy to actually cure fully, to give up, to make up that space, because otherwise it wouldn't be rigid and it would be flopping around. So I actually ended up having to pull the tubing out, pull the rocket off, and that just caused a whole world of problems. The wires were just caked in epoxy, of course, so I had to find a spot where I could cut them, and unfortunately didn't leave me much room to add additional length of wire. I had to pull out the barrel adapter that I had in here. And really, I mean, at that point, the best, most straightforward way of getting it in, because I wasn't going to because by that point I had poured so much epoxy in here from the first one and then the second one that it was actually pouring in here. So what I should have done was actually like shoved something up in this hole to keep the epoxy from flowing back down in. So lesson learned there. But anyway, The only thing that I could really think of to do was actually just to attach a little pigtail and then shove the wires in there and put some epoxy in there to, you know, keep it in place, keep it from being pulled out. And that's what it is. It's on the back. You don't see it. I ended up having the sand and then refinish the top of the base. You can kind of see a little bit of gradation between the two finishes. The tubing is a little rougher. Unfortunately, it's one of those situations where if I try to sand the tubing, because again, you can only go in one direction, then I end up hitting the base, and then that just makes the base look bad, so then I have to sand the base, and then I end up affecting the tubing, and then, yeah. So I've got to call what it is just good enough. The transition between the tubing and the base, that joint there is a little rougher. What I should have done was cut a little like thin piece of the walnut in a circle with a hole in the middle and have that slipped over the tubing, so then I could have slipped that down and glued it to act as a transition between the base and the tubing. Hindsight is 2020 though, so it is what it is, and I'm gonna just accept that this is as good as it gets for this. Because otherwise I'd be here for another year trying to fix it. And yeah, so that was really nerve-wracking. I found a short in one of the wires in the process of pulling things off and that, so I ended up having to put some heat shrink on both wires, shoving it up the tubing as far as I could. And then while assembling the whole thing as much as possible, I had my multimeter in continuity mode so it would buzz if there was a short. While I was assembling everything to make sure that it wasn't. At one point I thought maybe I burned out the LEDs, which I know I said that the LEDs, that it looks okay and it looks good without the LEDs, but I mean, I put the LEDs in there. I wanted the LEDs to work. So that was nerve-wracking. That's why I didn't film any of it, because turning on the camera at that point and filming it was just not something that I was feeling at that point. So apologies for not filming any of that. But that's why I'm explaining it now. So yeah, I think I said the fins and the base are walnut. This is just a piece of scrap, 4x4 like this. The finish is just some roll-on polyurethane. I did, I don't know, 7 coats, I think, on the rocket. I basically put a coat on, sanded 220 grit between each coat, and kind of did that until I got bored with putting finish on. And then put some paste wax, polished it up with some paste wax to help give it a little bit of a shine. With a lathe, you know, and the skill to use the lathe, you could probably make something like this in fairly short order. I didn't really want to go through the expense of, this wasn't a project that justified buying a lathe. At some point, a lathe might be something that I want to get, but for this project, I couldn't justify it. This is just a project that was one of those things that was popped in my head, and I just had to get it out.
Yeah, and just to address in case anyone wants to comment on it, yes, I was using the angle grinder in arguably unsafe ways throughout this project. There was a couple times it actually bit me. I still got a little bit of scar on my thumb right there. It is what it is. I'm not encouraging that you use any tool in an unsafe manner. But yeah, I need it. The means to an end. And I took that risk, and I alone am responsible for taking that risk, and I'm not encouraging anyone else to take that risk. So.
But yeah, I just used a combination of flap discs and sanding discs, and at one point I even tried an actual metal grinding disc, and then eventually lots of hand sanding, some random orbital sanding. So yeah, that's the completed project. Call it a carving, call it a model, call it a nightstand. You know, of course, it's modeled after those sort of 50s era rockets, which I like the aesthetic of. And yeah, this is what it does. And I'm happy with it, and it makes me happy to look at it, and that's ultimately the point. I'm not even sure where it's gonna live. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like, of course, subscribe, thumbs up, all that stuff. That's the same as like, thumbs up. And I will see you on the next one.
If you don't make stuff, there's no stuff.